This is Stone Cold Export, and in this video we will be testing this thing. This is the MSI RX 6600 XT. So let's start off by unboxing this thing. So in this box there is this thing. There's a envelope with some paperwork. Let's see what's in here. Just various stuff. Manual, how to upgrade your PC with a new graphics card. Join MSI's reward program, yada yada yada. So a bunch of different papers, not really interesting. This is the interesting part. So here we have the card itself. Sorry about the noise. This card features 4 display outputs, 3 DisplayPort version 1.4 and 1 HDMI version 2.1. There's a nice metal backplate with cutouts for airflow towards the rear end of the card, and the heatsink itself is substantial. We do have some RGB here as well in the MSI logo. The twin fan design helps keep the card compact, and the length of the card is 277 millimeters. And it's 130 millimeters tall, which should make it fit in most modern cases. It does take up slightly more than 2 PCIe slots though, so keep that in mind. Build quality is okay, but not great. Some of the plastic on the fan shroud feels a bit cheap, and they have removed the RGB between the fans that are present on the higher end dual fan Gaming X models. There are also no dual BIOS here, so no silent and performance mode. But the most important thing is the cooler performance, and here MSI haven't skimped on a thing. We see extremely good performance here. Edge temp barely crosses 60 degrees Celsius, with junction temp 18 degrees Celsius higher, and there's no change when overclocked, and this is well within safe margins and then some. Memory temperatures were particularly impressive at 68 degrees Celsius and only a 2 degree increase when we overclocked. VRMs remained nice and cool, which is not surprising as this is a very efficient card, but does this come at the cost of increased noise? Well, no. Fan speeds remain very low even after the overclock. Noise measured 35.5 dBA, 30 centimeters away from the front end of the fans, and slightly higher after the overclock due to the slightly higher RPM. But this is a very silent card, you will struggle to hear this in your system. The performance of the cooler means that this card would get an A in both temperature and noise, which is well done MSI. Now let's look at power consumption. We use the Corsair RM1000i and log power draw at the 12V rail while running Timespy Extreme stress test. Then we average the power draw after the test. This RX 6600 XT only has one 8-pin power connector for a good reason. At stock, the average 12V power draw was 212 watts, which is about the same as the GTX 1070, and way less than the RS 5700 XT. Overclocking increases the power consumption, but only by 14 watts. Now let's look at the Avg Core Clock while running Timespy Extreme. At stock settings, this card has a so-called game clock of 2428 MHz and a boost clock of 2607 MHz. The average core clock on this card was 2580 MHz while running Timespy Extreme, and maxing out the power slider, which is a mere 4% increasing the core clock slider to 2750 MHz, and after that we see a mere 4% increase in average core clock. And we'll take a look at performance a bit later on. So right now let's take a look at stock performance, and we have quite a bit of data here, so feel free to use the timestamps to skip forward or backward if that's what you want. In the synthetic benchmarks, the 6600 XT performs about on par with the 5700 XT, with a small lead in Superposition 1080p Extreme. In Port Royal it came in last, but I don't have a lot of RT capable cards, but it's safe to say that RT is probably not what this card does best. Getting into gaming performance, in order to keep the video somewhat short, I'll try to move through this quickly. Starting with ANNO 1800 at 1080p, the 6600 XT is 70% faster than the old GTX 1070, but the previous fastest AMD GPU at this price point is still 9% ahead at 1080p. This increases to 14% at 1440p, and at 4K that's up to 19%. In Apex Legends, the 6600 XT is pushing almost 200 frames per second and has a small 2% lead over the 5700 XT, and it's not that far behind the 2070 Super, and actually delivers better frame times at 1080p. At 1440p, the 6600 XT was able to hold off the 5700 XT, but unable to catch up to the 2070 Super, and at 4K, the 5700 XT has now overtaken the 6600 XT. In Assassin's Creed Valhalla, this card really flies. At 1080p, the 6600 XT is pushing 5% more frames on average than the 5700 XT, and 20% more than the 2070 Super. RDNA cards really shine here, and RDNA 2 even more so. At 1440p, the lead over the 5700 XT is down to 3% and 8% over the 2070 Super, and at 4K it's basically on par with the 2070 Super and 5700 XT. Next up then is Assetto Corsa Competitzionne. This game runs best on Nvidia GPUs, but the 6600 XT is 4% faster than the 5700 XT at 1080p, and 32% ahead of the aging GTX 1070, in case you got one of those. At 1440p, the 6600 XT and 5700 XT is basically on par with each other, with the 2070 Super having a healthy 22% lead. And at 4K, the performance between the 5700 XT and 6600 XT is identical. Control is up next, and in this game the 5700 XT was 13% faster than the 6600 XT, which doesn't bode well for the high resolutions. At least the 6600 XT was 60% faster than the GTX 1070. At 1440p, the 5700 XT extends the lead over the 6600 XT by a single percent, now up to 14% faster, and at 4K that increases by an additional percent, which makes it 15% faster than the 6600 XT. Cyberpunk 2077 is next, and the 5700 XT is ahead only by 2%, but the 6600 XT was able to deliver similar performance to the 2070 Super at 1080p. The same cannot be said at 1440p, where the 2070 Super is 14% ahead, and the 6600 XT was still slower than the 5700 XT, which I suppose we could expect. At 4K, the 6600 XT is not doing well, and this is definitely the Achilles heel of the 6600 XT. In Doom Eternal, the 6600 XT is 2% ahead of the 2070 Super, but is unable to keep up with the older 5700 XT. At 1440p, the 6600 XT loses out to the 2070 Super, and the 5700 XT is 8% faster. And of course, at 4K, things get even worse, and the old 5700 XT is now 21% ahead of the new 6600 XT. Forza Horizon 4 is next up, and it's finally a win for the 6600 XT, albeit a small one. At 1080p, it's 4% ahead of the 5700 XT and a decent 18% ahead of the 2070 Super, and it actually breathes down the neck of the 3070. At 1440p, the 6600 XT is able to stretch its legs and overtakes the 3070 and pulls away from the 5700 XT. It now has a 10% lead. On 4K, the 6600 XT struggles, and even though it's still faster than the 2070 Super and edges out the 5700 XT, the 3070 has now overtaken it. In Rainbow Six Siege, the 6600 XT again falls short of the 5700 XT and 2070 Super, which is disappointing. And things gets even worse at 1440p and 4K. On the bright side, it still delivers very playable performance in this game though. Last up is Shadow the Tomb Raider, and here the 6600 XT slots in between the 5700 XT and 2070 Super at 1080p, and at 1440p it's now down to identical performance to the 5700 XT, and at 4K it's of course slower than both the 2070 Super and 5700 XT, which is disappointing but expected. Taking a look at average performance at 1080p, we have normalized for the 6600 XT, and both the 2070 Super and 5700 XT were on average about 2% faster than the 6600 XT. It is a decent amount faster than the GTX 1070, and whether or not it would be worth upgrading from it, I will leave that up to you. Average performance at 1440p is a bit worse. The 5700 XT and 2070 Super are now 4% faster on average. It does manage to retain the lead over the 1070 though, and I think even if AMD markets it for 1080p, it's an okay 1440p card. Average performance at 4K though, that's poor, which is to be expected due to the low memory bandwidth and small infinity cache that will have a poor hit rate at 4K. The 5700 XT is 9% ahead here, and the 2070 Super is 14% faster, while the 6800 is a massive 71% faster at 4K. And even the 1070 has slightly closed the gap. So 4K is not the... you should not get this card for 4K, even though you could do it, but I wouldn't, and you shouldn't. So with this card, AMD did introduce some new features though. We have full support for DX12 Ultimate, which means ray tracing and VRS support, among other things. So let's take a quick look at ray tracing performance on this card. Starting off in control at 1080p, the 6600 XT managed under 30 frames per second average, and with no FSR support, you will have to turn down settings in control for it to be playable. The closest card is the 2070 Super, which is 84% faster at 1080p, and this is before enabling DLSS, which would put the 2070 Super ahead of even the 6800. The 6800 actually does okay for ray tracing at 1080p here, and delivers over twice the performance of the 6600 XT. At 1440p, it all falls apart for the 6600 XT, and it only managed to do 11.7 frames per second average, making the game completely unplayable. And the 2070 Super is around 3 times faster without DLSS, and the 6800 a bit less than 4 times faster. And well, 4K is basically pointless, as you can see. 5 frames per second average, not great. It's more of a PowerPoint presentation than a game at this point, so let's just stay away from 4K. Although none of the other cards deliver good native performance there either, but the Nvidia cards can use DLSS, which would make it playable. I only tested one other title for RT performance, and that was Doom Eternal at 1080p. With RT turned on, the 6600 XT is able to keep the average above 60, but the frame times are fairly poor here, and I do believe this is in part due to a memory limitation. It is safe to say you can do RT ray tracing in Doom at playable frame rates if you turn down these settings. But here at 1080p, the 2070 Super was actually faster than the 3070, which might make you call BS. But the reason for that is VRAM. So the 2070 Super I got here has 8.2 gigabytes of VRAM, while my 3070 has 8.04 gigabytes of VRAM. And that was actually enough for the 2070 Super to pull ahead of the 3070. And the 6800 is fastest due to its 16 gigabytes of VRAM. And yes, you can make use of DLSS to alleviate this issue at 1080p. At 1440p, same story, 6600 XT is only able to do 46.4 frames per second average, which is not great. I also included a DLSS result for the 3070 to illustrate that if you are rendering at a lower resolution, the VRAM becomes less of an issue. At 4K 8GB it's simply not enough, and I'm sure you can force it somehow, but why bother? Even DLSS performance requires more than 8GB, which means you can't really enable it on the cards. Overclocking the card improves our Superposition 1080p extreme score by 6%, while actual gaming performance improved almost 7% in Apex Legends and 8% in ANNO 1800. Given the minor increase in power, temperature and noise, I think it's well worth overclocking this card if you do get it. Now let's talk about value. So value is a depressing topic these days. Here we have value at 1080p, and as you can see, the 70s series card from Nvidia has been steadily going down in dollars per average FPS at 1080p and more so at 1440p if we use the MSRP. The 6600 XT offers slightly better value than the 5700 XT did at launch. That's not really progress, so that's disappointing, even though MSRPs doesn't really matter. So let's take a look at actual value at 1080p. So here we have value at the prices that I actually paid for the cards. So back in 2016 I paid $688 for the GTX 1070 adjusted for inflation. The 6600 XT costs me more, slightly more, well slightly, it cost me more than the 5700 XT did and slightly less than the 2070 Super. And given this, the 5700 XT was a better buy, and the 2070 Super offers similar value, but if you factor in the ray tracing performance is a lot better, it also represents better value than the 6600 XT. And the prices for the 3070 and 6800 is actually, these are the prices I paid. They have since gone up in price, so they are even worse value now. But yeah, so that's the current market at 1080p. It's a mess, and I won't really compare value at 1440p because yeah, it's basically the same story over again. So let's just skip to the conclusion. So in conclusion then, the RX 6600 XT from MSI is a great card. It's the cooler is amazing, it's cool, it's quiet, and you do have a bit of overclocking headroom if you would like to do that. The thing I don't like, that's the red connector right here. I wish that was black or placed on the back end of the card here. Anyway, it's a great card. Price-wise, it's a bit of a shame. It performs slightly worse than the 5700 XT, and it is slightly cheaper than the 5700 XT. So, on the bright side, you do get the X12 Ultimate support, ray tracing, even though performance-wise that's not very good. But you also get VRS and mesh shaders and all the X12 Ultimate stuff. So that's very good. For Scandinavians, you can actually pick these up for around the same price as the 5700 XTs were a couple of years ago, and it's a shame to say that's a positive thing, but that is a good thing. At least we are in the same spot we were 2 years ago. That doesn't sound right, but that's a good thing apparently. Yeah, if you are considering getting this thing or the 3060, there's plenty of other reviewers that have compared these two cards, but I did receive a package today, and in that package I found this.